Hello everyone, in this video I will do a breakdown of my Greyhawk Soulshatter build. This build can easily solo any content in the game, including the Exalted Tower of Trials. The way the build works is by using the old Cat Talisman plus Retribution build, which allows us to one-shot enemies, paired with some survivability items to be able to handle the Exalted Tower of Trials, and the new double primary augment Cosmera's Strength to allow us to spam our weapon techniques constantly and maintain invisibility frames. This is very important since we are not using Lion Talisman. The build is also making use of the new Shards to be able to stack Soulshatter build up on enemies faster. Let's take a look at how the Retribution plus Cat Talisman combo works and why it is so powerful. Retribution summons a fire elemental whenever you Soulshatter an enemy. This fire elemental seeks out an enemy and explodes, dealing fire damage equal to 50% of the Soulshatter damage you dealt. What this means is that if you deal 100,000 damage when you Soulshatter an enemy, the fire elemental will deal 50,000 base fire damage. This damage is amplified by fire damage and damage to ailments effects, such as Rift and Glamour. You can reach explosions that deal millions of damage if you stack a lot of fire damage and damage to ailments. There is also an additional effect that this fire elemental has, which is not mentioned in the description of the Retribution primary. This explosion also inflicts Ignite, which is based on the damage of the explosion, so if your explosion deals 1 million damage, the Ignite ailment will also deal crazy amounts of damage. Now let's see where Cat Talisman fits into all of this. Cat Talisman is a charm that triggers all of your Soulshatter items whenever you deal 20,000 or more Soulshatter damage. What this means is that all of your items that say whenever you Soulshatter an enemy in their primary trait will be activated if you trigger the effect of Cat Talisman. This means that all you need to do in order to activate the effect of Retribution is to deal at least 20,000 Soulshatter damage while holding it in your hand. Keep in mind that this effect cannot be activated for weapons that are in your offhand. The stats you want to focus on are critical hit chance, damage to bleeding enemies, resistances, and overhealth gained. Aim for at least 100% damage to bleeding enemies, 50% to all resistances, and 64% critical hit chance if you don't have double blessing of luck, or 40% critical hit chance if you have double blessing of luck on your weapon. Let's dive into the gear pieces. For the main weapon you have multiple options. Ideally you want to use a Blade of Conquest with the primaries of Seed and Drazkul's Legacy plus anything else that is useful, such as Sword of Courage or Sincerity. The reason for this is that the Blessing of Luck stacks with a greater Blessing of Luck, giving you a total of 60% critical hit chance, which means you can replace some of your critical hit chance rolls with other offensive or defensive rolls. If you do not have any good combinations of primaries, you can just use a regular Seed. Your weapon DPS should be physical to be able to inflict bleed, which gives you a damage boost of up to 30% depending on the number and power of the bleed stacks on the enemy. For the secondary stats, you should have double critical hit chance and damage to bleeding enemies. For the secondary weapon, you want to use a primal Retribution, which is the key of this build. The secondary stats on this are not very important, but you should aim to have damage to bleeding enemies, ailment power, and ailment duration. For the charm, you want to use a Cat Talisman, which is another key component of this build. For the secondary stats, you should have double critical hit chance, damage to bleeding enemies, and weapon technique damage. For the amulet, you want to use an Amulet of the Betrayer to prevent you from dying in case you get one shot. For the secondary stat, you should have critical hit chance, overhealth gained, all resistances, and again all resistances when upgrading to the maximum level. For the rings, you have multiple options depending on your primary weapon. You should always use a Citrine band as one of your rings because the Blessing of Endurance is extremely valuable in the Exalted Tower of Trials. If you have the ability to inflict ailments on your weapon, then you can use a Mark of the Red Armorer as your second ring. If you do not have this ability on your weapon, you have to use an Eye of the Dragon ring to be able to inflict ailments. For the secondary stats on both of your rings, you should have damage to bleeding enemies, overhealth gained, ailment power, and all resistances when upgrading to the maximum level. For your Lifestone, you should use a Cosmic Etherstone in order to gain more Arcane Fury charge speed and Arcane Fury damage. This is extremely important in the Exalted Tower of Trials. For the secondary stat, you should have double weapon technique damage, damage to bleeding enemies, and critical hit damage. For the banner, you should use a Plague Pennant, which increases your ailment power and the damage you deal to enemies for each type of ailment they have. For the secondary stats, you should have weapon technique damage, damage to bleeding enemies, and double ailment power. Let's move on to the Augments page. In this slot, you want to use a Rift Augment, which increases your damage for each type of ailment on the enemy. For the secondary stat, you should have damage to bleeding enemies and all resistances when upgrading to the maximum level. In this slot, you want to use a Glamour Augment, which has an identical but more powerful effect compared to the Rift Augment. For the secondary stats, you should have Overhealth gained, damage to bleeding enemies, and Might in order to boost your Void Shell Augment. In this slot, you want to use a Void Shell Augment, which gives you a lot of overhealth whenever you perform a critical hit. Keep in mind that it scales based on the might from adjacent augments. For the secondary stats, you should have Overhealth gained, ailment power, damage to bleeding enemies, and all resistances when upgrading to the maximum level. In this slot, you want to use a Cosmera Strength Augment, which can roll any two primaries of other might augments, except for ones that require adjacent augments. The two primaries you want on this are either Firmament plus Paradise for more damage, or Focus plus Paradise for more survivability. For the secondary stat, you should have damage to bleeding enemies and weapon technique damage, or Soulshatter build-up, then weapon technique damage when upgrading to the maximum level. In this slot, you want to use a Focus Augment, which gives you a bit of overhealth whenever you perform a critical hit. For the secondary stats, you should have damage to bleeding enemies and weapon technique damage. In this slot, you want to use a Paradise Augment, which gives you weapon technique charge speed whenever you perform a critical hit. For the secondary stat, you should have damage to bleeding enemies and weapon technique damage. In this slot, you want to use a Fortitude Augment, which gives you a lot of overhealth retention at the cost of some health recovery. For the secondary stat, you should have damage to bleeding enemies and all resistances when upgrading to the maximum level. In this slot, you want to use a Divine Conduit Augment, which gives you 50% Archon Fury charge speed whenever you get hit. This is very important and useful for the Exalted Tower of Trials. For the secondary stat, you should have damage to bleeding enemies and might in order to boost your Void Shell Augment. Let's move on to the Shards. The two shards we are using for this build are Way of the Hawk and Soul Rend. Way of the Hawk deals 9% Soulshatter build-up every second for 10 seconds whenever you deal at least 15% of an enemy's health in Soulshatter damage during Rampage. This shard is extremely powerful if you can maintain it as often as possible, but at the moment it is bugged and it doesn't always activate even if all the conditions are met. I have reported this bug to the developers and hopefully they will fix it in the next patch. Despite being bugged, it still works most of the time, so this is still the best shard for Greyhawk. Soul Rend applies a shatter tag whenever you hit an enemy with a timing attack. Whenever you soul shatter an enemy that has a shatter tag, it explodes and applies 7600 soul shatter build-up to nearby enemies. This is similar to Hinterclaw's Doom tag. Let's move on to the skills page. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but I will go into detail for the more important ones. Weapon timing level 5 allows you to use a timing attack after your northern and southern weapon techniques, which is a key part of the build. Since we are not using Lion Talisman and we are relying only on Paradise to get weapon technique charge, the iframes we get during the Lancer timing attacks are a very good buffer time for us to get a full weapon technique bar. Sundering Slam level 4 gives you 30% bonus damage whenever you hit enemies with it. This is important for the Exalted Tower of Trials as enemies are very high level and they have a lot of health. Rampage level 4 allows you to enter Rampage and it makes it charge faster and lasts longer. This has good synergy with the Way of the Hawk shard. Polarity attacks level 5 allows you to use polarity attacks and also makes it charge faster. This is crucial for the build as you will use polarity attacks to trigger the effect of Retribution. Let's move on to the playstyle of the build. With this build, your goal is to trigger the effect of Retribution whenever you think it would deal enough damage to one-shot a boss and every other enemy around it. Keep in mind that your polarity attack takes a while to charge, so you don't want to waste the Retribution proc. You want to start off every fight by using your Sundering Slam when it is fully charged, then start spamming your Northern Technique plus timing attack combo to start applying Soulshatter build-up. Do not use your Southern Technique unless you want to kill a weak enemy or trigger Way of the Hawk. You want to stack a lot of Soulshatter build-up and then use your polarity attack to trigger Retribution and kill everything. Try to group as many enemies as possible together before doing your polarity attack, so that you kill as many enemies with a single proc. You want to focus your attacks on any mid-boss or boss instead of regular enemies, so that every other enemy is grouping around them and to allow you to stack a lot of Soulshatter build-up without killing your target. Once you think you have enough Soulshatter build-up on the target, use your polarity attack and everything should be dead, either from the explosion or from the ignite ailment that gets applied by the explosion. On elevator rooms, try to activate your Way of the Hawk shard on a weak enemy before focusing on a large group of enemies or a boss. This will make your Soulshatter build up much faster and guarantee an easy one shot. That will be it for this video. Thanks for watching and consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy the content.